than all of your ruins. In the silence that followed this remark, Miss Crow, who was shepherding her little party with as much care as Emma's father and the mendest ever guided his flock down to the washing pool, took the opportunity of handing to Rachel and Ned a veritable May Day nosegay. She noticed Philip turn to the vicar and ask him for sympathy about Wookey Hole. She noticed that her new cat, a big stray tabby that Tossie had christened Tiger, had come in as Tossie went out and had jumped upon Tilly's lap. Tilly was now absorbed in this cat. She had been watching it ever since it entered, hoping against hope that she would be the preferred one in winning its favor, and now this had happened, she was in bliss. So Miss Crow turned to the lovers. "I want you to take Lady Rachel to Chalice Hill this afternoon, Mr. Adling," she said. "There was an antiquary about here yesterday, not the one who found the Edgar Chapel by the help of that spirit, but quite a different one. And he unearthed a stone up there, somewhere to the west of the hill, so they tell me, and near Bulwark's Lane, which has completely puzzled him. You might tell me what your opinion of that stone is, Mr. Adling. At any rate, I'd like you to see it before you begin your long drive home. And I want you to have a bite of supper with us, too, before you start." Rachel's cheeks flamed with pleasure at this, and Mr. Adling met his hostess's eyes without blinking and smiled with childish gratitude. It was a shame that Tossie had left the room too soon to hear this. As it was, it had been with a deep sigh for the presence of her friend that she had returned to the kitchen without the tray. She could hardly bear to look at the bluebells at the table now. So greatly did she long to tell their absent donor all about what was going on in the drawing room. "You don't mind me speaking freely to you, Decker, do you?" Philip was now saying. "But it really won't do. It simply won't do for you to mix yourself up, and your position and everything, with this man Geared. The man's a rascal. That's the long and short of it. He's an extremely cunning rogue and an arrant charlatan. He'd like to play the part of a sort of abbot in this town. This pageant of his, or pious circus, or whatever it may be, is getting to be a nuisance. You were saying, weren't you, Aunt Elizabeth, that you've been worried by these endless notices from that little fool, John? Geared must learn that in these days to be mayor of a town like ours means nothing at all. This and that money he's got from my grandfather seem to have turned his head. He's begun to encroach on your domain, Decker, hasn't he, with all these rehearsals that I hear are going on?" Lady Rachel glanced quickly at her young farmer, but it was impossible to stop him. "I like Mr. Geared," he said, with a rush of hot blood in his face. "I think he's done a great deal for Glastonbury. I think this pageant will bring a lot of people here." He stopped abruptly and glanced apologetically at his hostess. "From abroad," he added. "Germans especially." Philip glanced at Tilly, but she was oblivious to everything except the cat on her lap. He then sought to exchange with Matt Decker this particular look, with which older people condone the impetuosity of youth. "The most important thing from any town nowadays," he said calmly, looking now not at Atling but at his aunt, "is to give the populace constant employment. That is not done by pageants, is it, Aunt Elizabeth?" "What about the municipal factory, sir?" threw in young Atling. "May I ask you if you've seen that concern?" said Philip. "Seen it? No, yes. I mean I've been to this new shop in George Street and brought some little things." "May we hear what things, Mr. Atling?" "Charming things," broke in Rachel. "I've got lots of them in my room upstairs." "I'm glad you found something, Lady Rachel, among their toys that thrill you so much, but I'm afraid Mr. Decker will agree with me that the men employed in making those toys are being rapidly unfitted for any properly paid job. They hardly give 'em enough to live upon. I expect you did know that, Mr. Adling." "They're going to let me design some figures for them, Mr. Crow," said Rachel relevantly. Who is? Inquired Philip. Mr. Barter, the girl answered. Barter? Philip brought out these two syllables as if he had been King James referring to Guy Fawkes. I suppose you've heard, Decker, the inside story of that man's leaving me? It had to do with... He stopped abruptly, remembering that the victim of the story had just been handling him those rock cakes he had enjoyed so much. Well, at all events, he went on, lowering his voice a little, out of respect to Lady Rachel, if not to Tossy, Barter, as we know him, isn't exactly the sort of person that any concern would be proud of. I've never heard, either, that he knows very much about the manufacturing of toys. You can't do these things in this sort of slipshod amateur arts and crafts way. What do you say arts and crafts so despairingly, sir? Threw in Edward Atling. Elizabeth intervened. I could explain that, she said. When Philip was at Cambridge, there was a lot of aesthetic tittle-tattle going on about that sort of thing. It's all very old-fashioned. You two children are too young to understand the point. I can understand what Mr. Crow, being a manufacturer of machine-made articles, naturally has a dislike of handmade things, said Edward Atling, getting very red. Just as a farmer, remarked Philip sternly, naturally has a dislike of townspeople getting high wages. What about this strike in the dye works, then? Isn't that for better wages? The young man had scarcely uttered these impetuous words that he gave a curious kind of laugh and stretched out his hand to Philip, touching his sleeve. Sorry, sir, he said. That was an impertinent thing to say. I'm enough of a farmer to hate the way we ignoramuses rush into arguments. No doubt there's a lot to be said for your ideas of industry as something that gives the people steady employment, rather than just a dramatic adventure for the moment. But the municipal factory is sure to last, isn't it? Insisted Rachel, noticing how stiff Philip was in the way he received Ned's gesture and feeling angry with Ned for making it. Philip shrugged his shoulders in silence. What I feel in all this, said Matt Decker, is that Glastonbury needs both its scientific manufacturer and its dramatic mayor. Matt Decker was so happy at this moment, being at once pampered by the ancient love and jealousy pleased that his son was separated from Zoyland's wife, that he uttered this peaceful remark with a certain careless unction, without thinking very much what he was saying. Lady Rachel looked at him with flashing eyes. That smug antithesis, its scientific manufacturer and dramatic mayor, filled her with contempt. Simple, earthy natures like Matt Decker, especially when they have, by luck, found themselves in a social position which cannot easily be menaced, frequently allow themselves to be dominated by their physical moods. When Mr. Decker on this occasion threw out that smug remark about scientific manufacturers and dramatic mayors, it was in reality no more than if he had said, "It is May Day. I enjoy rock cakes. I am glad that my unaccountable desire for Nell Zoyland has been quieted by Sam's separation from her. I like being petted once more by dear old Elizabeth. It's nice here now that she has shut the sun out." Nothing that was said being talked about just then touched for Matt Decker the real essential things in life. He did not, in his heart of hearts, think that it mattered very greatly to Glastonbury or to any mortal soul in Glastonbury, whether it were Mr. Crow or Mr. Gurd, who was cock of the dunghill. And since this was the case, it was easy for him, treating Philip as he would have treated a greedy minnow in his aquarium, to give the man a soothing sop with the surface of his mind and push the whole thing away from him as unimportant. But how was Lady Rachel, trembling with eager excitement in the presence of her first love and full of the intense partnership of youth, to be tolerant of a hard-working priest's mental indolence? All that afternoon, as she had surveyed this big red-faced personage drinking so much tea and letting himself be waited upon by a gentle, elderly lady, she had suspected him of being a repulsive time-server, and now she knew him for just that. But Miss Elizabeth Crow was not one to be baffled by any clash of temperament among her guests, or by anything as negligible as a flash of anger on the part of the excitable little daughter of Lord P. By the time her elder guests had departed, she had beguiled them all into good temper. Indeed, both the young people were found making Tilly laugh with girlish delight by their antics, with Tiger in the sunny doorway when Elizabeth had finished saying goodbye to her other guests. Whew. When Rachel and Ned Addling had reached the top of Chalice Hill, they spent a happy quarter of an hour hunting about for that stone of which they had been told. I don't remember what that was all about. I'll have to go back sometime and figure this out. I don't remember. At last, not greatly worried because they had not yet found it, they sat down together on a fallen log with the greenest of new-grown ferns and bracken on their feet and a sweet-smelling gorse bush behind them. "Do you believe it was really here," said Rachel, "that Merlin disappeared with the Grail?" "Oh, okay. I don't remember who told him that, though." Ned did not reply for a second or two. Then he burst out irrelevantly, "You'd like an Exmoor pony, Rachel. That's what you'd like." Yeah, that is pretty irrelevant, isn't it? He wasn't a Christian, was he, Ned? Merlin, I mean. What was the Grail to him? That's what I can't imagine. Rachel. Yes, Ned. Did you have a fear when you were little that you'd never meet anyone as exciting as the people in books? Oh, Ned, how curious. How like we are. That's just what I always felt. She picked up a cowslip within reach of her arm and gave it to him. He smelt at it and held it tight between his finger and thumb, waiting to hide it away in his pocket as soon as her attention wandered. "May I ask you something, Ned?" was her next speech. "If it's not about poetry, Rachel, since I've known you, I've been changing my idea about what poetry is, and it's got all confused." "No, it's nothing about poetry. Well, what is it, Rachel?" "It's about people. One's own people. Don't you sometimes feel as if you were a changeling? Don't you sometimes feel that when your own people are talking and telling you this and that, quite ordinary things, that you're all the time living in a different world? I don't mean exactly a different place, the same place, only seen in quite a different way." "It's in that different way I've seen everything, Rachel, since I've known you. My horses, my cattle, my sheep aren't the same creatures that they used to be. Of course, those fields down out way at Middlezoy look the same as they always did, but they look more the same, if you know what I mean. I never knew before how different they were from all other fields and how much like themselves. Could you ever endure to live anywhere else, Ned, than at Middlezoy?" "I used to think I couldn't, but now—" He paused and plucked at the fern-like leaves on an incipient yarrow. "I believe I could live anywhere else, almost anywhere, if I were absolutely sure of one thing." She refrained from pressing him as to what that one thing was. "I suppose you've sunk your soul into those fields in Middlezoy." "Well, even if I have, I couldn't pull my soul out again, couldn't I? Like anyone might pull out a deep thorn." "I didn't want you to say you could. I wanted you to say you couldn't." So he said could there. I said couldn't. Because I'm just going to read. I'm going to go back. She refrained from pressing him to what that one thing was. "I suppose you'd sunk your soul into those fields at Middlezoy?" "Well, even if I have, I could pull my soul out again, couldn't I? Like anyone might pull out a deep thorn." "I didn't want you to say you could. I wanted you to say you couldn't." Now we're all cleared up. The log that we're seated upon was not larger enough for any space to exist between them. At those moments in their conversation, when one of them would naturally have indicated a psychic misunderstanding by a physical withdrawal, all they could do was to move their knees or their feet a trifle further away from those of the other. The girl shifted her legs a little now, and in this slight movement the profile of her cheek was turned. Ned snatched the opportunity and slipped the cowslip into his waistcoat pocket. The magic of that moment, the scent of the primroses and the damp moss, the tremulous ecstasy of the birds and insects, The unusual greenness that washed up against their feet like a wave of the primal sap of creation covered them now as a couple of early violets might be covered by lush, transparent overgrowths that guard and enhance their poignant breath. If you and I were ever, by any chance, to marry, Ned, would we live at Middlezoy? Would you marry me, Rachel? I might, Ned, but you mustn't take this as a promise. Besides, what am I saying? I am acting as forwardly as Juliet did. But we must see each other a lot more, lots and lots more, before we can know for certain that we dare do it. Edward Atling sighed deeply. A profound sadness took the place of the excitement he had just felt. The way she'd spoken, though everything but frivolous, had not been exactly the kind of ambrosial food that a lover demands. Yeah, I'll see you later.